30 feet below the waterline in a room with no window. A woman is trying to fall asleep at 2 in the afternoon. Above her, 3,000 passengers are playing shuffleboard, ordering pina coladas, and photographing the horizon. She can hear none of it. What she can hear is the groan of the engine room next door, a sound that never stops because the ship never stops. She has 8 hours until her next shift starts, and she needs at least 6 of sleep to survive it. Here's what most people assume. Crew members must have some hidden version of a passenger cabin. Smaller, sure. Less fancy. But basically the same idea. A room with a porthole, some daylight, a place that feels like it belongs to the sea. That assumption is wrong in almost every detail. The truth is that a modern cruise ship is really 2 ships stacked inside one hull. One of them is built for pleasure. The other is built like a submarine, windowless, compressed, engineered down to the centimeter, and it exists specifically so the first ship can keep functioning. Somewhere in that second ship, right now, thousands of people are living an entire parallel life that most passengers will never notice. On schedules that don't match daylight, in spaces designed by naval architects who had to solve a problem no land-based hotel has ever faced. How do you house a small city, permanently, at sea, without it ever intruding on someone else's vacation? By the end of this video, you'll understand why crew quarters are built the way they are. Why an entire hidden corridor system, nicknamed after a U.S. highway, holds the whole operation together. And why the person who made your bed today may sleep in a room smaller than a prison cell by design, not by accident. The first explanation people reach for is cost-cutting. Cruise lines are corporations. Corporations minimize expenses. Therefore, crew cabins are small because the company is cheap. There's a kernel of truth here. Cruise lines do optimize every square foot of a ship, and labor costs are a real part of that math. But this explanation collapses the moment you look at the numbers. A modern megaship like Royal Caribbean's Icon of the Seas carries roughly 2,350 crew members to serve around 5,600 guests. That's nearly 1 crew member for every 2.5 passengers. If cost-cutting were the whole story, cruise lines would simply hire fewer people. They don't, because service quality is the product. So cheapness alone doesn't explain a corridor structure this deliberate. The second explanation is more sophisticated. People assume crew cabins are small because crew members are lower in the ship's social order than guests. Full stop, the maritime equivalent of servants' quarters in an old manor house. This one has real historical roots. Ocean liners in the early 1900s absolutely built rigid class separation into their architecture. But it doesn't explain why an entry-level cabin steward and a senior officer live in dramatically different conditions on the same ship. Despite both technically being crew, hierarchy exists, but it's not organized the way people expect. The third explanation is safety. Some assume crew live below the waterline purely because it's structurally safer down there. Thicker steel, more stable in rough seas, less sway during a storm. This is partially true, but it's incomplete, because it doesn't explain why some officers live above the waterline, closer to the bridge, in cabins with actual windows. If safety were the only variable, everyone would be stacked in the same reinforced zone. Rank be damned. There's a fourth explanation worth taking seriously too, because it's the one crew members themselves bring up most often. Space is simply finite, and every square foot has to be justified financially. A single deck on a megaship might run the length of 2.5 football fields, but that length still has to be divided among engine rooms, fuel tanks, ballast systems, kitchens, laundries, medical bays, and cabins for both guests and crew. Something has to lose that competition for space, and on a ship built to sell vacations, the losing side is rarely the one generating ticket revenue. This explanation gets closer to the truth than the others, but it still treats the crew deck as leftover space, a byproduct of design, rather than something engineered with just as much intention as the guest decks above it cost. Hierarchy, safety, and finite space are each real forces, and each one shows up somewhere in the story. None of them alone explains the actual architecture of crew life. To understand that, you have to go inside the system cruise lines built to solve a problem most passengers never even realize exists. How do you house a small city's worth of workers, invisibly inside a floating hotel that never stops moving? So what's really going on down there? The answer starts with a single hidden hallway that most passengers will glimpse for maybe 10 seconds. In their entire cruise, usually while boarding or getting hustled through to a lifeboat drill crew members call it the I-95, named half-jokingly after the interstate highway that runs the length of the American East Coast. This corridor runs the entire length of the ship, bow to stern, usually on Deck 0 or Deck 1, right at or below the waterline. It is the ship's actual nervous system. Laundry carts roll through it. Room service trays move through it at 3 a.m. Off-duty dancers walk through it in bathrobes on their way to the crew gym. Officers use it to get to the bridge without ever crossing a guest deck. Everything that keeps the visible ship running happens invisibly. In this one artery, picture it like the service tunnels beneath a Las Vegas casino, where staff move between kitchens and slot floors without ever being seen by a gambler at the blackjack table. The I-95 is that idea, scaled to an entire vessel, sailing at sea for 6 to 9 months at a stretch. Different cruise lines even have their own names for it. On Royal Caribbean and Carnival ships, it's the I-95. On British lines like P&O, crew call the same kind of corridor the A1 after a motorway back home. The name changes. The function never does. Why build it this way instead of just giving crew normal staff corridors like a hotel does? Because a cruise ship isn't a hotel. A hotel's staff go home at night. A cruise ship's staff are home for the length of their contract. And that changes the entire design problem from how do we move workers efficiently into how do we house an entire workforce permanently without it ever visually interrupting a vacation. That brings us to the second layer, the cabins themselves. A standard shared crew cabin is startlingly small, often under 100 square feet for 2 people. Bunk beds, a shared bathroom barely large enough to shower, brush your teeth, and sit down in, sometimes simultaneously. No window, because a window means expensive exterior hall space. An exterior hall space is reserved for cabins the company can sell to paying guests. Every square foot of outward-facing wall on a cruise ship is, in a very real sense, real estate. Crew don't get that real estate, because crew aren't the ones buying the cruise. Think of it like an apartment building, where every unit facing the street rents for triple the price of the interior units, except on a ship. The interior units are given to the people running the building, and they live there for the entire lease. Crew members have their own name for this arrangement too, and it tells you everything. They call it college dorm meets submarine. Every inch is engineered for function. Not comfort, a bunk with barely enough headroom to sit up without hitting the ceiling. A closet built for a few uniforms rather than a wardrobe. A bathroom small enough that you could, in theory, brush your teeth, shower, and use the toilet without moving your feet. One crew member who spent 7 years working Disney ships described her first cabin tour taking 45 minutes. Not because the ship was confusing, but because every hallway looked identical steel. Low ceilings, the same door every 10 feet. Deck after deck of it. Like the ship had swallowed a hotel's worth of storage units and forgotten to label them. That's layer 1 solved. But here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If all crew live this way, why does a ship's captain sometimes have quarters with a private living room, a king bed, and a full-size window looking out over the bow? This is where rank enters the picture. And it isn't about status for its own sake, it's about function. A cruise ship runs on a strict maritime hierarchy inherited from naval tradition, where officers hold legal responsibility for the vessel and its passengers' lives. Deck officers, the captain, senior engineers, and department heads typically live on higher decks, closer to the bridge, sometimes with actual windows and private bathrooms. Entry-level crew, cabin stewards, waitstaff, kitchen porters live lowest in the ship, in shared cabins, often below the waterline where the engine hum never fully disappears. This isn't just tradition for tradition's sake. In an emergency, officers need to reach command positions in seconds, not minutes, so their quarters cluster near the bridge by design. Meanwhile, service staff cluster near the areas they service: galleys, laundry, housekeeping stations, because efficiency during a 14-hour shift depends on minimizing walking distance. The ship isn't organized by comfort. It's organized by function, and comfort is just a byproduct of where your function happens to sit. Which raises the next layer of the mechanism. Sleep itself becomes a scheduling problem, not just a housing problem. Most crew members work 6 or 7 days a week, often 10 to 14 hours a day, for contracts lasting anywhere from 4 to 9 months, depending on the cruise line and role. There is no night in any meaningful sense for a cruise ship's crew. Someone is always on shift, which means someone is always trying to sleep while someone else is showering, laughing, or coming off a closing shift in the cabin next door. To manage this, crew learns something almost nobody on land has to learn. Sleeping in shifts becomes a skill, like a language. Veteran crew describe it almost like a night shift nurse or an ER doctor might, training your body to fall asleep on command. In daylight, through noise, because the ship's rhythm doesn't wait for you, some crew describe napping in fragments throughout a 24-hour cycle rather than sleeping in one long block, essentially living on a polyphasic schedule, not because they chose it, but because the ship's operational tempo demands it. The roommate becomes part of that engineering, whether either person planned for it or not. To strangers, often from opposite sides of the planet, are placed in a room with barely enough floor space to stand between the beds and told to make it work for months. Crew who've lived this describe a kind of unspoken code that develops fast. Headphones on when the other person is sleeping, lights kept low, a curtain pulled across the bunk as the only real boundary either of you gets. Get a good match, and your roommate becomes the person who understands your schedule better than anyone back home ever will. Get a bad one, and the smallest habits, snoring, a phone left on too loud, someone coming back from a closing shift at 2 a.m., start to feel enormous, because there's nowhere else in the room to retreat to. And that tempo never actually stops, which leads to the deepest layer of all. The entire crew quarters system exists to solve one continuous, unsolvable tension. A 5-star guest experience requires an invisible labor force. And an invisible labor force still needs to eat, sleep, shower, and occasionally just sit somewhere quiet. So cruise lines built an entire shadow infrastructure to contain that need. Crew mess halls serving food around the clock. Crew bars where staff from Manila, Bucharest, and San Jose end up teaching each other salsa steps after midnight. Crew gyms, and sometimes even a crew-only pool tucked near the bow, invisible from every guest deck. It's not an afterthought. It's a parallel city built into the bones of the ship, running on its own clock so that the visible city above it never has to notice it exists. Once you see this system, you can't unsee it the next time you board a cruise ship. That perfectly made bed, the fresh towel animal, the pasta dish that arrives exactly on schedule, every one of those small miracles is being produced by someone who, an hour earlier, was asleep in a windowless room the size of a walk-in closet, 30 feet underwater, with a roommate they've known for 4 months and will remember for the rest of their life. It also reframes something passengers rarely think about: the sheer logistics of hospitality at sea. A luxury hotel on land can staff up locally, send workers home at 11 p.m., and rebuild its labor pool every season. A cruise ship has to bring its entire workforce with it, permanently, across oceans, for months at a time, which means the ship isn't just a vacation vessel. It's a self-contained labor colony that happens to also sell vacations. And there's a quieter implication buried in all of this. The I-95 corridor and the crew decks below it represent one of the largest examples on Earth of intentional architectural invisibility. Casinos hide their cash counting rooms. Theme parks hide their utility tunnels. But a cruise ship hides an entire population, sometimes over 2,000 people inside a structure designed so precisely that a guest can spend 7 days aboard and never once glimpse the world that made their trip possible. Here's the detail that reframes everything you just learned. Those crew members chose this. Many of them are sending the bulk of their paycheck home to families in the Philippines, Indonesia, Eastern Europe, or Central America, places where a cruise contract, despite the windowless cabin and the 14-hour days, can outturn almost anything available on land. The tiny room below the waterline isn't just a cost the industry imposes. For a huge share of the people living in it, it's a calculated trade made willingly, in pursuit of something bigger than the cabin itself, which means the real story here was never really about square footage. It's about an entire hidden economy moving silently beneath a floating vacation, built by people who sleep in shifts so that yours never has to be interrupted. If stories like this, the hidden infrastructure behind things we take for granted, are the kind of rabbit hole you enjoy falling into, that's exactly what this channel exists for. Stick around. There's a lot more hiding in plain sight.